So warmly welcome everyone to this seminar on a super interesting and highly topical issue. The seminar is called Election Assistance in Times of Democratic Backlash. And it's organized by the expert group for aid evaluation, and we will, as it is Friday, it is also movie time, so we will show you a tiny little movie on presenting EBA. As a göteborgare, it is always especially nice to welcome people to a Stockholm venue, and especially such a beautiful one as this one. My name is Helena Lindholm, and I am the chairperson of EBA, and I'm so happy to see people here coming to listen to this highly interesting topic and to be in real life. We also have an audience online, so we have this highly technical setup. And after the presentation and the panel, there will also be time for questions and answers. And for those of you who are here, if you want to prepare yourself, then you will need also to come up here because you need to be visible in the camera. For those of you who are online, the Q&A function will be the one function that you use for Q's and A's. Okay, so by that, I think I would like to introduce our small movie.
Expertgruppen för biståndsanalys, EBA, är en statlig kommitté som oberoende analyserar och utvärderar svenskt internationellt bistånd för att det ska kunna förbättras och utvecklas. EBA har 10 ledamöter med kompetenser från olika biståndsområden och ett kansli som verkställer besluten. Förutom våra rapporter så ordnar vi seminarier, workshops och möten mellan olika parter. Varje år sammanfattar EBA sin verksamhet i årsberättelsen Biståndsanalys. Den kan beställas från kansliet eller laddas ner på eba.se. EBA har ett oberoende i relation till uppdragsgivaren regeringen, liksom i relation till vad som utvärderas, samt till de rapportförfattare som anlitas. Rapportförfattarna ansvarar själva för slutsatser och rekommendationer i sina studier. Allt vi producerar som rapporter, seminarier och vår podcast EBA-podden finns tillgängligt på vår hemsida.
And there are lots of interesting stuff to take part of on that webpage. We are living in times that are problematic in different ways. Actually, we are seeing a very dramatic, a radical decline in democratic principles throughout the world. At the same time, democracy is something really important for Swedish foreign policy and Swedish development cooperation. And one of the aspects of Swedish democracy aid is election support. EBA have produced, together with a great team, a report which is called Supporting Elections Effectively. And that report will be presented here now today by Therese Pierce Lanela from IDEA, who has led this team. This report is unique in very many ways, and one way in which it is unique is that it is based on practitioners. There is a corps, an international corps of practitioners working with election support, and the team has gathered knowledge and experience from that corps. And I'm so happy to introduce Therese and the report to us here today.
Thank you so much, Helena. It has been an absolute joy to work with you throughout and with the EBA Secretariat and in particular the EBA Reference Group for this study. It has been an absolute joy. I'm here on behalf of the study team. It was a team effort to put this together. We were 4 lead writers, of which Sead, who is in the room, led our work, and 2 are not with us today. They're on their way to various places, but that is Peter Wolf and Antonio Spinelli. We also had a brilliant research team led by David Tauris, who did all the background work, and they are sitting in the back over there. So giant thanks to the research team. They're partly in the back and partly online. All right, so many of you are here today because somehow this topic touches you, and you may have noticed what EBA noticed when they first contacted us to write this study. And that is that there seemed to be something slightly amiss or difficult. That is that support to democracy seemed to somehow be getting harder. And elections, being a particularly high-risk area, seemed particularly hard. And even though there was great experience and knowledge over time on conducting electoral assistance, it felt like something was a little bit amiss and perhaps needed a reboot or a rethink. This led us, those of us who took on this, to take this on because we'd been feeling the same thing. And in fact, the enthusiasm of all those who helped us with this study shows that this is a generalized feeling, that there is in fact an opportunity for revitalization or rebooting, that we're in a different period right now. And so this study tries to go through that systematically. Where are we now and where do we need to go? As Helena mentioned, this is really an entirely, almost entirely, practitioner-anchored study. The reason for this is that what is going a little bit wrong in the field is not something that's easy to understand. It's something that you know when you experience it, but it may be difficult to quantify. And so we used a methodology where we tried to unpack what was going on. We tried to establish two things. One is, what are the expectations for effective electoral assistance? What should it look like? But then, and here's why we chose practitioners, what is it that stops that ideal picture scenario from realization? What makes it difficult? What are the obstacles? So the first task was to go through the literature review, and here we focused on policy documents, guidance documents, overarching evaluations from UNDP, from the European Union, from donors. And we pulled from that a framework that guided us through our work from then on. Thomas Carruthers, who's joining us in a few minutes, he will recognize some of these principles because he was part of drafting them. We summarized the good practice that was identified in these various guidance documents, and we clustered and put them together and put together this framework that you see on the screen right now. And it captures what the various documents in various ways said that electoral assistance, the way that electoral assistance should be conducted. And as you'll see, some is related to support to actual elections, but it also shows a broader picture, a picture of supporting electoral institutions and the frameworks that are around elections. So it's not just making sure one election gets that one election gets held, as we might think of electoral assistance, but rather the broader infrastructure and the broader culture that makes elections credible and acceptable to the population. Some of the principles that we found are really specific to elections, and examples of that are the electoral cycle approach, and, for example, the importance of linking electoral assistance with electoral observation. But some were an attempt over time to align with broader principles of development. So in the early days of electoral assistance, it was very election-focused. But over time, particularly the Paris Aid effectiveness, influenced how electoral support should be conducted. And what we found was that these principles largely hold. People thought they seemed valid, but they're actually really difficult to implement on the ground. And so that's where we put our focus. We also found that they need updating, and so that is one of our recommendations. I'm showing you one example from the survey that we conducted with practitioners. We wanted to know, do these principles still seem valid? And how do they manifest on the ground? What is it like? We wanted to just find the sticky points. And I want to show you one of those sticky points right here, which is that while the principles remain valid, people generally think that these principles were fine, there are real differences between different actors on what they prioritize and expect on the ground. So you'll find state actors, for instance, the international community who are paying for electoral assistance. They're extremely interested in geopolitical stability. They'd like to see stability in a region, and that is the overriding interest. Whereas those at the national level may have other interests. For example, in this case, it was the actual participation, the real and genuine participation. So that's the more interesting part. And it's how these different interests manifest on the ground that is one of the problems that we unpacked in the course of this study. The interviews were very, very helpful for helping us see how this all played out on the ground. We asked, for example, what are you tremendously proud of? And we wanted to know over time. So we interviewed people with perhaps 2, 3, 4, or even 5 decades of experience in democracy promotion across multiple organizations, so the real veterans. And we said, what kept you, what lasted beyond the intervention? What was still there afterwards? Because we were looking for this sustainability angle. And what they were especially proud of was the field of electoral administration, that there is a field with active, robust people who are committed, robust institutions in a way that didn't exist 30 years ago. So what lasted beyond individual interventions, we summarized as norms, networks, knowledge. These were the more long-lasting. What was more short-term was procurement of materials, for example, and so forth. But it's this part that's at the bottom here that was the one that we tried to unpack in the interviews. What is it that's happening on the ground that makes it difficult to do electoral assistance well? And there were some really real horror stories there of how these dynamics play out on the ground. Remember that elections are high-stakes environments, and you've got a really, really short time, and tensions run high. We took 4 of the especially sticky points identified through the surveys and the interviews, and we brought them to an expert audience, and we tried to bring them to a consensus point, and I'll show you the consensus points in a moment. But the 4 specific issues that we brought to them is, how is it so difficult to design or implement electoral assistance that has a lasting effect, that gives an effect beyond the event and over time? What is this political will that people keep bringing up as a difficulty or as an obstacle to assistance? Many people also said elections in the future are not the same as elections now, and the modalities that we are using are not appropriate for elections the way that they're looking later. So we tried to unpack that as well. And we also tried to unpack an area that was consistently underperforming, which was the locally anchored dimensions of electoral assistance. Why is it that this principle of local ownership seemed to be particularly difficult to incorporate into electoral assistance programming? The expert working groups, were tasked with finding some kind of a consensus. This is across organizations around the world and also across different types of actors. And we validated these consensus points in 5 parts of the world. In Canberra for Asia and the Pacific, so for example, New Zealand and Australia, the election commissions who do electoral assistance, they joined us there. A New York one where the Global Affairs Canada and USAID and IFAS and other actors joined us there. In Africa, from Addis, Arab world from Tunis, and then Brussels for the EU audience. And what they broadly had as a consensus about where electoral assistance is now, and then where it needs to be, a little bit shorter, these are the consensus points that, and this is the distillation of many, many reams of evidence and so forth. But it basically presents a picture that there is a tremendous amount of good work that's happening, and over time it's made a difference, but that times are changing now. It also paints a picture that the regional dimensions of electoral assistance work is under-resourced, but has great potential for serving electoral assistance. And that the way that we do electoral assistance really can't be transactional. It's much more relational than we ever might have thought, and that actually has to be incorporated into how we do programming. So this idea that it's context-sensitive, responsive, long-term oriented, cooperative, reflective, and learning-oriented, these are not always what you see when the reality on the ground is that an election is coming up in 6 months. So how incorporating these is not easy. To put all of this together, we had a picture whereby we knew as a community what electoral assistance should look like, but there was that sticky something that makes it difficult to understand how to get this, what is it that stops it from happening in practice. And we took this picture that I've described to you, and we used 3 lenses on it. And the reason for this was to be able to come up with recommendations. This was a middle step for coming to recommendations. And they all really look at the same thing, but from a different perspectives. And the first one is knowledge. The special thing about elections is that they are both tremendously political. They are anchored in what is happening on the ground at that moment. But they're also operationally very complex. You have to reach every adult citizen within the same day. And so that takes tremendous preparation in advance. There are many things that have been learned over the years, and very few individuals are sitting with all that knowledge of both a local context and also how to organize elections. So there's a tremendous need for that knowledge to flow to be effective. And we saw that when electoral assistance wasn't being done effectively, there was often blockages in that knowledge flow. So for example, one example could be that it is a junior embassy official who ends up being tasked with the electoral assistance responsibilities without perhaps the preparation or backing or understanding of what's going on on the ground. And that might lead to a tendency to pick, low-hanging fruits or easy choices, when in fact the choices are very difficult. So that's one example of knowledge not flowing. The other way of looking at it is people not cooperating on the ground, and that the mechanisms not being there for this to happen. And Afghanistan was one of the examples that was given multiple times by multiple people as a place where those different motives collided on the ground. The imperative for geopolitical stability collided with participation, the need to include many, many people, or the need to have credible and genuine elections, or the need to have institutions that lasted for the long haul. And there seemed to be difficulty in the actors on the ground to put that into some kind of coherence, and that the outcomes were then not optimal. The particular problem for elections when actors on the ground, or even in headquarters, but behind the electoral assistance, don't cooperate, the particular problem for elections is that it is time-bound. And so every delay has knock-on effects that can risk the election itself. So this is this makes you've got a high-stakes environment with a lot of different interests and real-time pressures, and when there is a delay in, for example, funding because people can't agree, or a delay in legislation, every single delay has a knock-on effect that can risk the election itself. And nobody wants a risked election, and nobody wants the repercussions of an election that goes wrong can be quite dramatic. So this inability to cooperate is the second part of the analysis. And the other part was simply that everything is changing. So even though there may be electoral assistance modalities that made sense some time ago, they may not make sense for the future. And there's three things in particular that we noticed and wanted to bring up. And that is what didn't exist maybe when those principles were being designed in the way that it exists now, is deliberate strategies to undermine the credibility of elections. That wasn't really foreseen when those principles were done or when electoral assistance modalities were first designed. And that's something we have to incorporate much, much more, is skill sets, rapid response mechanisms and so forth when elections are being deliberately undermined. Secondly is that technology is just leading elections forward in a way that they will look different in the future. And the ability to manage that technology and keep it sustainably over time is something that will mean that electoral assistance has to change somewhat. There's a different skill sets needed also there. And that the pandemic showed us the extreme weather events, security issues, cybersecurity threats. There's an element where crisis is now becoming almost a new normal. And so in the old days of electoral assistance, it was supporting institutions to hold excellent elections and supporting perhaps civil society to hold them accountable. But now it's not just about managing or holding or running elections. It's about the ability to manage what hits you. It's that new skill set that's needed and those new mechanisms. And electoral assistance as it's designed now may not be fit completely for that purpose. So those are three areas to think about as we move forward. So the broad picture that we see from this analysis is of mechanisms that are broadly okay, but are getting blocked. There is knowledge, but it's not reaching the right people. There are excellent actors working on the ground, but they may not be cooperating. And things are changing, but there may not be the mechanisms to adapt to that change. And so we've used the picture of an aqueduct where the irrigation is there, the systems are there, but they haven't been maintained or taken care of. And for this reason, all of our recommendations are really about clearing up those pipelines for communication and knowledge to flow, to make perhaps electoral assistance more thoughtful, more agile, and more responsive. So our first recommendation, we have three. It's meant to the global level, and that is to encourage global actors. We can imagine the Biden administration summit now as an example of this, but that the issues facing democracy are such that national level strategies aren't going to be enough, that there has to be cooperation and rapid response mechanisms at the global level that can help both set mechanics that broadly work for all, knowledge sharing across regional global actors. And two specific examples of this that could come up, any kind of mechanism would be helpful, but two specific mechanisms would be to upgrade the OECD DAC recommendations from 2014 and make them more fit for purpose for being able to handle disinformation and those type of things which weren't foreseen then. Another specific example could be to ensure that the Biden summit type meetings are something that happen regularly. In the same way that we see the election observation community, they've done a brilliant job. They meet every year, they have working groups, they interrogate their normative frameworks, they create relationships between each other. That doesn't exist in the electoral assistance world, and it's needed. We can use the climate change modalities as a model where it's possible for donors to meet with civil society, to meet with academics, and together talk through issues and create those relationships that when something hits, you've already got those relationships pre-established. So modalities that allow for rapid reaction because you know who's who, who's doing what they're working on, and allows for knowledge sharing. For example, USAID has some gorgeous tools that they're developing for needs assessment missions, and they're really willing to share them. But what modalities can they use to share those tools that they've developed? The second of the three recommendations focuses on this realization that the regions may be the optimal resting place for capacity building, norm building, knowledge exchange that has a lasting impact over time. And this can be the regional level can be particularly helpful when we see authoritarian slippage in particular countries. That is, that there's a regional level competence, regional friendships and so forth that can keep an eye on any friends who are in trouble and help them with protection mode. And regions can be better than the global level just because of language and cultural ties that help knowledge flow in a way that makes sense. So here is an area where Sweden excels, and we've given a few examples of that in the report. In fact, Sweden is probably the leader in the world, really maybe one of the only donors who supports regional activities. That's actually wrong. Australia and New Zealand support a Pacific Island network, but Sweden has been very helpful in this field. Otherwise, electoral assistance, the bulk of the money tends to be for national elections. The third recommendation is about that national level support to elections. And here it's really about a reboot and a rethink that allows for change, that you don't have structures that are too rigid, that recognizes that it's a fast-moving area in which to work, and that the actors on the ground have to be able to move fast. So that's the third one. So I will leave it at that. That's the main points from our study and the main recommendations, and I really look forward to the conversation afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Therese, for a great presentation of a great report. I will now introduce the panelists and invite Staffan Smirby up on the scene. So our panelists are Staffan Smirby, who is head of the unit of democracy at SIDA, and then has a responsibility to work with democracy issues in Swedish Development Cooperation. And online from Washington, we have Thomas Carruthers, who is really an expert, a leading expert in this field, who has been working on democracy, foreign policy, and development cooperation for a long time. He is currently the head of the unit, the chair for democracy studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. And he is currently taking a break from Thanksgiving celebration in order to be here with us today, which is great, and we are really thankful for that. Well, now I am really curious to hear from Staffan and Thomas their kind of takeaways from the report. And I would like to first ask Staffan, what do you learn? What did you learn from this report, and what will you take with you in your work at SIDA?
Well, thank you, Helena, and thank you, Therese, for the presentation. Well, this is highly interesting, I think, and I learned a lot from reading it. That's the short answer. But I think it's, to me, it comes as a very timely and relevant report. I think it makes a lot of sense to look at this point. I mean, it has been referred to in the introductions and in the presentation, the kind of world that we live in and the developments that we have seen during many years now, and perhaps even more so also during the pandemic, with the worsening trends in terms of democratic backlash or decline or erosion or whatever we want to call it. I think that it makes a lot of sense to look at electoral assistance and how can electoral assistance become more effective in that general context. And that, I think that development that I refer to is also, I mean, one of the reasons that we at my unit at CEDA, we are also now kind of refocusing our work on electoral assistance. That comes partly as a reflection of the guidance that we get from the Swedish government. As recently as, well, less than a year ago, the government decided on a revision on the strategy that guides our work. And one of the things that they put more emphasis in this revision was precisely electoral assistance. So that's something that we work with, and also for that kind of egoistic reason, it's very timely, the report. It makes it we can make very good use of it. I think it's useful also in a very broad sense, I think, because obviously we can learn from it and make use of it in terms of looking at electoral assistance as targeted initiatives. But I think it's also very obvious from reading the report and from knowing the principles that this has a very broad application. It makes sense in very much of what we do broadly within democracy assistance. So and that was one of my kind of general, but I think important conclusions from reading it. Perhaps the most important thing that we can do as a donor is not to increase our targeted funding for a few more initiatives of electoral support, but rather see what we do broadly in lots of other areas that in one way or another relates to electoral assistance and contributes to it. And that could be through freedom of expression actors or media or independent journalism or civil society organizations working with marginalized groups and their participation, etc., etc. ICT and digital security, etc. Yeah. So that's some of the takeaways.
That's great to hear. Eba, we are at our happiest when the reports and publications are used and of relevance to the actors who we think are our main stakeholders. We will get back to those issues, how it can be used, etc. But Thomas, what are your thoughts? And especially perhaps if you could reflect a little bit upon the principles and guidelines, since the report talks about perhaps revising those. So please, Thomas.
Thank you very much. I learned a lot from the report. It's an outstanding report. I haven't seen such a serious, thorough, really well-researched report on this topic before. So I congratulate the authors and the expert group for having commissioned it and taken the exercise so seriously. But what I learned is one central thing, which is that the electoral assistance community has had a very hard time coming to grips with how much the world has changed. I feel the report takes us down a road, but it's striking to me that we're only starting down this road now. So let me explain what I mean a little bit. I felt that the report had a no drama quality to it, which in a way I appreciate because I'm kind of a no drama person myself. But there's drama out there. Maybe it's just because I'm living in the United States, where there's a fundamental struggle for democracy going on in the United States, and it centers around electoral administration. Our country is in a crisis over electoral administration, with fundamental doubt in our next two elections about whether we'll have electoral administration with basic integrity or not. And so if one of the world's oldest democracies is struggling with electoral administration, something big is going on this topic. And I felt that the report, as we say in English, sort of buried the lead, in that I felt it could have started with the observation it makes far down in the report that electoral integrity is declining globally. In that short statement is something very profound, that the electoral administration community has been doing what appears to be solid and good work for 30 years or more, yet electoral integrity is decreasing in the world. So that has to make you ask, is it that we're not doing enough, or we're not doing the right things? And I felt that the report could have started with that observation a bit more dramatically. and really pose the question of, are we sort of knocking on the wrong doors, or are we not knocking loudly enough on the door in some sense? And so I felt that the principles, which are very good principles, were written 10 to 15 years ago even, and that they represent what is the fundamental challenge for the democracy assistance community, which is that democracy assistance was based on an idea from the 1980s and 1990s of knowledge transfer, in which there were people in the world who had knowledge about democracy and people in the world who had inadequate knowledge. And the goal of democracy assistance was to transfer knowledge, versus something very different. The problem in the United States, for example, about electoral administration isn't really a problem of knowledge. And it isn't a problem which went together with the concept of knowledge of political will. There's plenty of political will in this country. It's just clashing political wills. It isn't. The concept of political will is, in my view, has become a troublesome concept for the democracy assistance community. Because the idea that we're simply in some countries where there's political will, and in some countries where there isn't political will, implies that if people would just wake up in those countries and get some political will, then we'd be in a better path. That isn't really the problem. The problem is that people have plenty of political will, but it's destructive. And so I felt that, I'll just finish with this, that the report could have framed a bit more sharply maybe a landscape of three kinds of cases. There's still some countries, say like Ghana, where electoral administration is basically functioning, and maybe in the aqueduct metaphor needs a bit of desilting, a bit of cleaning out and improvement. Second category of cases are where things are starting to go down a bad road. There are starting to be attacks on electoral administration. Mexico is one such case. Mexico has excellent election administration, a really outstanding system of electoral administration. But the government under AMLO is attacking that system. And he's starting to call into question the basic legitimacy of independent electoral administration. What to do in cases that are starting down a very bad path. And then the third category are cases that are far down that bad path, but are still having elections, like Venezuela. I was just reading in the New York Times yesterday about the Venezuelan regional elections of this weekend. It said, the government showed that by banning the most prominent opposition leaders from running for office, dividing opposition parties, encouraging voter apathy, keeping a loyal minority dependent on government handouts, it can win elections without resorting to outright fraud, even with minimal popular support. That's the third category of countries, where the democracy is undermined through the elections, but not per se through the electoral administration. So I felt like when we talk about context awareness in those principles, we need to go much farther and say, what are we going to do in those second and third category of countries? Because those are the sorts of situations we're facing now that are so troubling. I mean, I've gone on a bit long then, but I just wanted to frame my remarks in a very large-scale way.
Thank you so much. That's great. Both sombering in a way, and that categorization into three groups is really helpful. I think. I was wondering, Therese, would you like to reflect upon the comments just briefly before we move on? Yeah.
Super helpful. So thanks for reading it so thoroughly. I'll pick up on one point, which is Tom's point about knowledge and linking it to the broader point of protection and this urgency. So if we think of knowledge not so much as in the old way, the way that Thomas described it, which is those who know how to organize elections share that knowledge with those who don't, and then that's all okay. Okay, I get it. That kind of knowledge is we're past that now. With this sense of urgency, there's something else that needs to happen. But I would argue that the sense of urgency also speaks to knowledge. And what kind of knowledge is it? It's that backsliding, that attack on elections, it happens not obviously quite often. It happens behind the scenes in legislation that you can't quite check what it is, and at levels where you don't quite know what's going on. And it takes knowledge to be able to follow it. Firstly, to know what legislation information to look for, or what points in the process. It could be the procurement process, all kinds of points in the process where something could be going seriously wrong, or the way that actors, maybe something like a culture of fear that's happening that means people don't express themselves and so forth. So the ability to understand what's going on and to go, that is going on. So that's one kind of knowledge, the knowledge that something is going on that is amiss and it's not okay. That is also knowledge. But then there's the ability of the other kind of knowledge, which is to know what is expected. And that is where normative frameworks matter so much. What are the obligations? What does a good electoral process look like? What does freedom of movement look like? What do political rights actually look like? What have you signed up for? So that knowledge and the ability to link what's going on the ground with those principles is knowledge flow. And it doesn't sit with one person. It sits with talking about it and getting it kind of sorted out. So I just wanted to make a plug for dealing with the urgency, but partly by putting actors together and mechanisms to be able to notice what's happening before it happens. So those kinds of mechanisms are worth supporting.
Well, thanks a lot. I have like two chunks of questions, and the one deals with Thomas' thoughts about the times we are living in right now and what election assistance might mean in those times, and there I would like to talk a little bit about what are the main challenges for this particular support to elections in times of like an authoritarian backlash, so to speak. And could election assistance as one particular form of democracy aid serve specific purposes in our times? Could it provide actually platforms to counter autocratization? This is one chunk of questions I would like to talk about. And the other one, which I will come back to, deals with what we can learn from practitioners, because as theories aptly show, this report is unique in the sense that it is based on the like very hands-on and real experiences of people who are working in this field. And what can we draw out from that, and how could, for example, Sweden position itself in that material? But first then, what are the main challenges for election assistance in our times? What do you say, Staffan?
Oh, I guess there are many, but I think that, what I see is, I think that was what Tom referred to, the issue of political will, and it's not so much an easy question about if there is or if there isn't political will, but it's actually clashes between competing wills or opposing wills. So that, I guess, makes the context increasingly complex and difficult to navigate in. Another thing that I think has been obvious over recent years is the importance of and the role that is being played by information technologies and social media, disinformation, misinformation, and so forth. That has a very, very strong, potentially negative effect on electoral processes. So just to mention a few, those are some.
That's already clear, I guess you can say. Thomas, would you like to develop your thoughts a little bit for us?
Sure, thank you. Well, let's take a case like Mexico. So when a country starts to head down a bad path in which a leader begins to attack independent electoral administration, what can the external community do? Because there we have a problem which is not a lack of technical knowledge. The Mexican system has outstanding technical knowledge. It's a different problem, which is an institutional guardrail is coming under a political attack. And how can that be countered domestically with international support? And so I would say that the challenge is, say there's Stefan, and suppose his team is asked, well, can you help with Mexico? What could you do? What should you do in such a situation? His first instinct probably wouldn't be, I need to go work with the electoral administration. unit in Mexico because they're actually in pretty good shape. Instead, what I need to do is go maybe work with an association of journalists to highlight the way it's coming under attack publicly, and maybe some public forums to talk about independent electoral administration, why it's coming under attack, and whether it should, and what would be the alternative. Or maybe some NGOs that are working on ways to counter government advocacy campaigns through alternative messaging and so forth. And so work on elections becomes work on electoral administration, becomes work that doesn't necessarily involve the electoral management body of the other country. And so we start to have a very changed focus when I say, how would you strengthen the electoral administration of Mexico today? My first partner wouldn't be the electoral management body. I would look to other partners. So that was just some initial thinking on that.
Are saying basically, and I guess you say that both of you, but in slightly different ways, that you cannot really separate election assistance from other forms of democracy aid, but you need to see it like a wholeness or in a holistic kind of way. Therese, what would your interviewees have said to this discussion?
I think would absolutely agree, and in particular Tom's point about this idea of defenders. So as we move, if we imagine electoral assistance as a continuum, in those early days there was a consensus that it was a good thing to do. Within the United Nations there was, member states really agreed that it was a sense of the early days of a better nation. But we're in a different place right now where we're going into protection mode. Now, who are the protectors? And Thomas mentioned a few, which is media, and then we've got civil society actors, and I would say academics as well. And there the trick is that they know what it is that they are, to have that granular sense to be able to say, that's not okay. That attack on the independence of that institution wasn't okay. And I think Indonesia gives another of those examples. We need to be having our eye on those middle countries that may be experiencing slippage, the ones that looked like it was going really, really well. But in Indonesia, for example, civil society are very strong and very knowledgeable on electoral matters, and they will defend the election commission. Of course, their job is to hold the election commission accountable if it doesn't deliver elections properly. But they're also there to defend it vocally when under attack, when its independence is being taken away. And it's those skill sets which are ones which we couldn't even have imagined 15 years ago.
And Staffan, support to civil society actors is an important part of Swedish democracy aid. And I would also like to, in this context, refer to another study that EBA did a couple of years ago on Turkey and Swedish development cooperation with Turkey in this kind of time with increasing authoritarianness. And that study focused on civil society actors and they express this kind of fear, like that. Please, donors, don't abandon us now. But we need this kind of connections with the outside world. So, what would you say to that? Like support to civil society actors in authoritarian times. Are there also problems with that, perhaps?
I think it's not. It's important, of course, to support civil society actors and to maintain that support over time. But I think it's also important to see in which ways we do it, because the ones that you're describing, are working in increasingly complex and challenging situations and environments. So we also need to see in which way do we support civil society. And I think one message that comes across importantly in the report as well is about working with flexibility and adaptation. That's very high on our agenda. So I think that when we work with civil society actors, we need to make sure that we give them as much flexibility as possible. So that in turn is about the cooperation modalities, funding more like core support arrangements, etc., etc. But it's I mean, the forms of the modalities and the forms and the long-term perspective, I think, is crucial.
Thomas, are there other ways you think that democracy aid should be like operating in those times?
Well, that's a pretty big question. I mean, I think that the domain of electoral assistance is like a microcosm of all of democracy assistance. And all of democracy assistance is facing the question of going from the technical to the political, going from knowledge to action, and of going from support to often to countering. So we're in a phase in which democracy assistance, which was built on the idea of helping countries that are moving forward continue to move forward, to, as Teresa puts it, protection, which is defending against attacks, requires so many different kinds of modalities that we're only starting to do this. And so, as Stefan says, working with civic actors, moving to greater flexibility and core support, but it's going to mean a variety of other things like that. It means, for example, that transnational repression is increasing, in which civic actors are no longer safe across borders, as governments are able to strike across borders at civic actors, at human rights defenders. So we need to be more attentive to that. As Teresa mentions, technology means that there's new technologically informed ways of attacking civil society, of surveilling it, of facial recognition, of personal surveillance, of algorithms that find civic actors and persecute them in various ways. So it really means upping our game and realizing that we're now, we're not just supporting democracy, we're defending democracy against those who would really like to deconstruct it and take it apart. Teresa mentioned Turkey, and she said the middle countries. To put it a bit more dramatically, think of the major countries in what we hoped was the democratic trend of the last 30 years: India, Mexico, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Brazil, Turkey. All of the large developing countries seem to be moving forward 10 or 15 years ago, and democracy today are moving backward. This is really, sobering. What this means is the middle stratum, most of the developing world, is in a fundamental question about whether democracy is going to work for it or not. So it's really a big shift in mindset and approach for the democracy assistance community to move out of the idea of the whole development assistance tradition, because development assistance is rooted in the idea, of course, everybody wants to develop economically. And so development assistance is simply helping those who would like to achieve an obvious goal. If democracy assistance is to be successful in this new world, it has to leave its roots in that idea that it's simply another form of assistance to those who would like to have it, and instead see itself as an action-oriented domain working against one of the most strongest or defining currents of this century. It's a pretty different kind of task.
Yeah, and it sounds like transformative in a sense that development cooperation needs to transform in a more profound way, perhaps than kind of like anticipated. But you're talking about defending democracy, and that's also how the Swedish democracy drive like formulates itself, or does it, perhaps not defending but protecting democracy. Swedish foreign policy, foreign politics are to protect democracy whenever it is threatened. I would like just to shift focus a little bit to this, to the form of the study with this, as we have emphasized now, this experience-based perspective. And one of the recommendations of the report is to try to form some kind of like global platform network for practitioners and policymakers to exchange views and experience, etc. Would you like to just develop the thoughts on that a little bit, Therese?
Yes, so those who are doing work, there's something about the way that some electoral assistance is structured. It for obvious reasons, but it's projectified. That is, it happens and then it finishes. And then a lot of things are somehow left hanging then. The knowledge, the experience, but also the imperative, something that you experienced on the ground, all those were part of experiencing. But because it was a project, it ends. And so those those loose ends don't get tied up. And so I'm really inspired by the climate change movement. The regularity of the Fridays for Future, the regularity of the COP meetings, this idea of multiple layers, activist layers at several of country-based initiatives that link up to the international ones, of business councils looking at it from their perspective, and activists looking at it from their perspectives, but of meeting up. And I think those ways of doing things are really critical to start introducing if we are going to be transformative. It can't be that, this results-based project, and it just won't do for these types of challenges that we're seeing now. But rather, this kind of, this is happening, what do we do? Mobilizing people so just quicker and more thoughtful. Those mechanisms are the ones that we need moving forward.
Thank you. And Staffan, this is perhaps not completely fair, but do you think Sweden could play a role in that, in facilitating or structuring, organizing such a communication?
Well, it depends on the form it takes, I guess. But I mean, the way you describe it, I don't hear you say that it should be the one big annual forum that somebody should arrange and fund. But it could, of course, be that as well. But I think there are many different ongoing arenas and platforms that could be used for this purpose. Also as a complement. I was thinking of, for instance, the existing Stockholm Internet Forum. Could that be something that you use also, for discussing election-related issues? Just as an example.
It's a really good example.
And I think there are a number of different such existing platforms and initiatives that could be used and rethought of, perhaps, and tweaked to serve also this purpose.
And just to build on you there, networks are protection modalities, because once people have met each other, when one of them falls into trouble, there's others who remember them and were there. So if we think of networks, courses, seminars, workshops, they build that connective tissue that can be really, really useful later in a crisis.
Thomas, what do you think? Are such networks something that could be used as defending in this situation? And after this, I will open up for questions from the floor.
Yes, I think it's a good idea. There's really no single kind of network that meets regularly on this topic, but we have to be attentive to what are the ways in which such networks are sometimes not effective. I've been following closely the preparations for the Biden Summit for Democracy, and it's really been a struggle to design a summit which will be of real meaning, because the tendency in a large gathering like that one, which is an official kind of gathering with heads of state who are going to make speeches and that kind of thing, is unfortunately a powerful tendency to a lowest common denominator effect, in which leaders come, make nice speeches, say that they're making commitments, but there's no real mechanism for follow-up, and it just becomes a bit of a show. And the Biden people are well aware of that risk, but getting away from that risk and creating something more meaningful with a sort of a sharper edge has really proven to be difficult. And so I think what we would want to avoid is any kind of international network gathering where, heads of electoral management bodies or ministers from certain governments come and make a speech and say, things are all fine in our country. Of course, we have a few problems around the edges, but we're doing this and, all is fine. So we've come to the network, we've met, we've exchanged views, and we go back home and life continues. We wouldn't want that kind of gathering. So we need to think hard about what kind of gathering would really be meaningful.
Thank you so much. The time has now come for questions from the audience, and I hope you have prepared some. Those who want to ask questions are welcome up here. We also have our eminent Deputy Managing Director at EBA, Mats Horsmar, who is monitoring the Q&A on the chat. But I will first ask if there is someone here who would like to take this opportunity to ask a question or reflect or comment in any way. Don't be shy. So how are we on the... You have a question? Please. Who? No. Ah. Maybe you have a question. Yes, please come up here and just introduce yourself briefly.
I think coming up here is a little bit intimidating. That's probably why.
Yeah.
My name is Vasil Vaschanka. I used to work at International IDEA a few years ago. I mostly do election observation work with OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights these days, OSCE ODIHR, Election Observation Missions. I wanted to go back a little bit to this remark about declining integrity of elections, which, as Thomas mentioned, is a short phrase that has a lot packed into it. And my question is about the learning curve, in a way. I think Thomas started on democracy assistance studies by describing the learning curve of democracy assistance. Perhaps we're seeing a lot of the effects of the learning curve on the other end. And by that I mean that from that knowledge transfer and no knowledge of democratic electoral processes, there's now a great number of countries where not only political actors know more about elections, they're quite considerably more knowledgeable about winning elections, and the costs for doing so, apparently at the expense of dismantling institutions, are not too great for some of them, because that's the way of continuing their game and staying in power. And so where this is taking place sometimes very rapidly, as with attacks on independent election administration, as with changing the rules of the electoral game. The question is, what can equip electoral assistance providers to, as someone said, up their game? How can they stand to this kind of, or what can they offer in return or in exchange for that, I would say, richer knowledge of how to basically bend elections and how to steal elections and how to thwart elections?
Great question. I guess that's for everyone who would like to start. Therese, you look like you're nodding.
Yes, it's such a good question. I like it so much. And it's it's what do we do about game players, like gaming the system, or what's sometimes called spoilers and so forth. Problem with elections is not many people win. Most people lose. And there may, in the best case scenario, it's a graceful loss. And unfortunately, what we're seeing right now is less than graceful. And as Vasil very well pointed out, that you don't get much pushback and the potential benefits can be really good. So you see suddenly the benefits of discrediting an election without worrying too much about the long-term consequences for democracy or for trust in electoral institutions in general. So that kind of short-term game playing is really, really dangerous, really scary, and exists. And as Thomas said, it's existing, it's coming in places where we hadn't imagined it before. And that is an example of what the report was saying about working together, because you need different skill sets to be able to point to something. It means you have to know what you're pointing to, but then have also the toolkit to be able to do something with that. So if we say the pointing to, well, who has those skill sets? The election observation community, they have excellent skills, tools and methodologies for going, that, not okay. But also the civil society organizations that they work with in countries. So there are mechanisms for that. But there, the disconnect that can happen where the flow is not quick enough is electoral assistance can be given by development, often development cooperation organizations, which are development oriented, and not necessarily perhaps by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the diplomatic community, who are faster movers. And those lines need to be quicker, whereby there are swift sanctions or swift noticing when those types of things happen. And they're often not super obvious, so you need that kind of qualified, that's not okay that that legislation went in that direction. So it can be, so the ability to see what's going on, but then that clout that comes as well. And those mechanisms need to be tightened and work a little bit quicker.
Thank you. Thomas, do you want to respond to that?
Well, I think, I would go beyond the concept of spoilers, Teresa, in that it's not just a spoiler, it's the whole system which is being, used for a bad purpose. I mean, elections in Venezuela are used to legitimate illegitimate power. So I think a question which you didn't really face in the report, but I'd be curious if you discussed it, you must have, which is, when should election assistance walk away from the country? When are you part of the problem rather than part of the solution? In that, when are you legitimating the process? Not you personally, but when are those who go to work with the electoral administration in danger of legitimating an illegitimate process? If, as I read the quote from Venezuela, governments have become masters of using other parts of the electoral system to undermine its legitimacy, even though the electoral administration is carried out reasonably well, should one still work with the electoral management bodies in such a situation? Is one in danger of legitimating the illegitimate?
That's a really important question. Let's get back to that soonish. And first, if Staffan, if you wanted to respond to that question about spoilers. No, thank you. No. Okay, so this is, I guess, one of the core challenges. When should election assistance end, and when should you not stay in those situations? What are there? Are there any particular conditions or criteria to be indicators to use in order to know that? What would you say, Therese and Staffan? And then,
if I start, I can say one of the possible reasons that it was there throughout the study. It was there, right there. But it was difficult to find consensus points around this. And I think perhaps one way of approaching it is that it's very difficult to have binaries because there are different perspectives and time perspectives to think about. So for long-term perspectives, it's not just the shenanigans of what's going on for this particular election. For shenanigans, you need someone calling it out, calling it for what it is, saying that's not okay, and creating systems whereby that isn't benefited. But for long-term ability to be able to withstand that kind of pressure, support might be needed. So this kind of completely retract the moment it gets scary or high risk, that didn't seem like an option. But on the other hand, oh, well, we're in it, and as long as it's organized well, that's fine. Potential for legitimizing, that's also not okay. And the ability to straddle those is really, really hard. But I think with clear communication and a clear sense of purpose, we are supporting this for the long term, but not this which is shenanigans. And the ability to see the difference is, I think, part of this idea of being more thoughtful and agile.
I mean that question is relevant not only for election assistance, right? But when does aid do harm, and when does it, and how do we know, and when do we know in a situation? Staffan, what would you say?
I think it's a great question, and I don't have a good answer. When would we refrain? When should we pull out from electoral assistance? But it makes me think of the importance of knowledge and context analysis and understanding when we need to ask ourselves that question and follow developments very closely. But also the importance of working very closely also in our case, with our Ministry for Foreign Affairs. I mean, the Team Sweden approach, I think that's a way of combining the development perspective with the more political sensitive capacities as well. But it's a very challenging question, I think.
Yeah, a challenging question to a challenging situation, right? We have one question from out there in cyberspace. Yeah.
Actually, not from out there, but it could have been written in the question and answer, which means that you could write your questions in this. But so one possible question could be, Therese, things play out locally, difficulties are local. Then you propose that there should be regional platforms or organizations sort of dealing with these issues that are basically local. Why is that? And then we hear Thomas saying that, well, we don't want these networks that are talk shows or sort of finding the lowest common denominator. What should a functioning and well-worth regional network look like?
Thank you.
Long term. So the Pianzia network, for example, in the Pacific Islands, the support and the sustenance it has given to its members came out, tangibly and viscerally, and that is the 20 and 30-year horizon. And similarly, a project which Sweden has been very supportive of, a UNDP project in the Arab world, over a decade that it's been supported. It's provided a safe space for actors to grow in their confidence, and particularly for women to grow in their competence as actors and as vocal in the debates in their home countries. And it was important that this happened at the regional level because it pulled away from the politics or shenanigans which can go on, especially in particular in small countries. So that regional gives that safe space that is difficult to find sometimes in a capital city where tensions are running high.
Thomas, do you think that's true, that regional platforms or networks make sense in that particular way?
Let me just step back and make a comment to something Teresa said. Teresa and I have known each other for a long time, and I've admired her work on elections, so she'll permit me from giving her a hard time a little bit. I don't like the word shenanigans. Shenanigans are something children do at a birthday party when things get out of hand and it gets a bit too noisy. What, AMLO is doing in Mexico, or Erdogan has done in Turkey, or Orban has done in Hungary, and so forth, those aren't shenanigans. Those are determined political projects for the sake of squeezing the life out of a democratic system. And so I think we have to be careful when we say long-term versus short-term, because the long-term project of those leaders is strangulation of democracy. And so there's one long-term project, and if we have a different long-term project, those two long-term projects are going to clash in significant ways. So I don't think this is just short-term versus long-term. As I said, this is de-democratization versus protection of democracy. Now, I think part of the reason Sweden, as you mentioned, has been the only really significant supporter of these regional networks is because Sweden has a faith in the long-term approach and the patient approach in a place like the Arab world, where other donors would say, why am I supporting the electoral management body of a lot of autocratic regimes? Does this really make sense? And so I think, because the Arab world is populated by autocratic regimes. And so I think this isn't long-term versus short-term. This is a question of what's a smart strategic approach in one place versus another. I think there's a good case to be made for supporting something like the Arab group of electoral management bodies, but you'd really need to get in and say, so Jordan, Morocco, Egypt, none of those countries is, on the democratic path. At what point does support for the electoral management bodies begin to show us some benefits? Or at what point do we say, not sure why we're working with all of these groups?
Thank you, and thank you also for reminding us strongly that the de-democratization process is not like something which is just happening, but there are actors making that happen with a particular political idea. I think that's really important to underline. We had a question over there. Yes, please, please. Everyone needs to be on camera. That's why you need to come up. Thank you.
Thanks. My name is Mikael Boström, and I'm with SIDA. I'm with SIDA's Policy Support Unit, and I've been working in this area of development cooperation for a very long time. I was very glad to see that in the report that this is more of a comment rather than a question, that there is a trend towards the donors adopting more of a electoral cycle report nowadays than seeing electoral assistance as just a kind of one-off things which you support over a period of 1 week or so. But I would say, and Thomas Carruthers also alluded to that SIDA and Sweden has tried to use such an approach for a very long time, at least for 20 years, the last 20 years. Maybe we have not been successful everywhere, but we have really tried to use a long-term electoral cycles approach in our electoral assistance. I also would say that we are doing what Thomas Carruthers recommended us to do, and that is we were trying to combine support to electoral administration bodies, electoral management bodies, with support to civil society organizations doing voter education, election monitoring, doing advocacy of different kinds. A challenge for us is, of course, for SIDA is to decide when and where to support election management bodies, to assess whether it is independent enough to be acceptable for Swedish assistance. Whether the support would do no harm, to refer to that concept, to do harm rather than do good. That's. I just wanted to stress this, that we are trying really hard. And maybe you can give us, Thomas or Therese, some good advice on this challenge to assess when and where to support election management bodies.
Yeah, thank you so much. Let's get back to that a little bit before we round up. Thomas, you were the one who threw out this important question, not only when to support but when not to support. So do you have any advice to Mikael and Staffan and others working in the field? How do we know? When do we know?
Well, I guess you could start with which I'm sure you do to some extent, but an examination and say if a country is clearly on a negative path, in which elections are being undermined systematically in the ways that we know are now the practices. First, what role is election administration playing in that process? Is the electoral management body contributing to that? Has it become a body which has been politicized in ways that make it part of the problem? And if so, is there any entry point at all in working with that institution? So having a fairly tough test. Then in the cases like Mexico, where the body is still a good bulwark against the de-democratizing leader who's pretty determined to undercut it, how could we change our assistance to upgrade it in a way that would make it well suited to such a context? And so it wouldn't be just about knowledge transfer. It might be some other forms of public support or legal support or whatever it would consist of. So I guess it's just as the report says, the context awareness or the political economy analysis really being very pointed and saying in these two kinds of cases, we need to answer some hard questions about why are we there working with the electoral management body and make a clear theory of the case of what's the purpose of that assistance.
Thank you. Therese, do you want to pick up?
Yes, and I can also maybe speak to what Thomas said before as well, and and combine the two. But I think something we have to look at when we look at context and so forth is where courage lies, is where are the courageous actors as we move into protection mode. And sometimes those courageous actors are in fact in the state administration. They will protect and so forth. And sometimes that can in turn make that institution courageous. So I think following that courageousness, but courageousness and the ability to have clout doesn't come from nothing. You have to have that confidence and capacity to be courageous. And so these incubators for courage, capacity, and have to be there as well. Those places where the future defenders will grow also need to be in place. And I think those can always be supportive, regardless of something being discredited. And that's where the regional level work can be a little bit of a protective device for the donor. It doesn't legitimize something in particular. If you have a regional place, which is like an incubator for thinking through what democracy looks like in that region and helps give sustenance to actors in whichever, whether from civil society or whether from an election management body or another ministry or wherever, that may be less risky, though, that type of work, but can give real benefit. But otherwise, I completely agree. And one of the ways you can do that political economy analysis, you can't just arrive and just know. And that's where electoral assistance can, in fact, be a little bit of a foot in the door if it's there long term. So those who have been on the ground, credible actors, I'm thinking of IFES, for example, in Tunisia, which we learned a lot about during the course of the study. But not a big program, but it, over time, they really see what's going on and can provide that intelligence. So they become actors in a ground that can see where courage is and where game playing is happening. So electoral assistance can also be a source of information.
Thank you. Staffan, do you think that this is helpful for SIDA?
No, yes, absolutely, and I agree with what you say. I mean, the need to be courageous and take risks and etc. And I think that's just as you said. I mean, the regional or global actors could sometimes, through the distance that it creates, make it possible for us to work in those contexts where it's very sensitive and difficult. But I think it's also about, for us as a donor agency, I mean, it's about having a combination of both context awareness and hopefully we do have context awareness in the countries where we are active, but we need to combine that with also the expertise on these specific issues. And that's a tricky question for us, I mean, in terms of resources and being able to have in-house all the expertise that we need. And if we don't have it in-house, we need to find ways, where do we get it? How can we cooperate with other actors where the expertise is, etc. So it's, yeah.
Yeah, it's getting darker outside, and it's Friday afternoon, so we will soon round up. But one thing that you all emphasize quite strongly is like the need for context awareness, and that's something that I also would like to. There isn't really time to get deep in that discussion, but sometimes, not here, but sometimes it becomes like something that we say that it's because it's so obvious. We know that we need to be aware of specific context. But what does it actually mean in different situations? Does it mean to know if, for example, we talk about Palestine? Does it mean to know what's happening in Jerusalem, or does it mean to know what's happening in Jerusalem and Ramallah and Hebron and like a local knowledge. But we will not go deep into that. I will give you 1 minute each to Yeah, tell us what's on your heart. What do you want us to take with us from this afternoon? I will let Thomas start, and then Staffan, and then Therese.
Well, I guess I don't want to repeat myself, but that this is a decisive moment, that electoral administration is at the core of the movement against democracy in many countries. And so this, the report says, again, buried down far in the report is the sentence, doing effective electoral administration often demands a recognition that electoral administration is both technical and political. And I felt like, wow, indeed. And I felt like, why is it that 30 years after we've been working on an endeavor which is fundamentally political, do we still need to put in a report like this that, remember, this is political? I feel like this field is very polite. There's something about the electoral administration field that's full of very polite people like Teresa, who are very thoughtful, very considered, very long-term. And all of those are tremendous qualities. But we need to bring out the other sides of the personality, which I know are also there, which is very determined, very pointed, ready to fight. Because maybe, again, I'm speaking from personal experience in this country, it is a fundamental fight for the future of our democracy over very basic issues of electoral administration. So let's bring all of our capacities to bear on this topic.
Thank you so much, Staffan.
Well, now I feel very inspired by the report and by this discussion. So I look forward on continuing the discussion and seeing how we can translate this into our work and our world. And as I said, the timing is perfect. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And for me, it's been, I'm so pleased for this opportunity to participate in this study. It felt like the moment was there to have that conversation. And the extraordinary thing was that people from all organizations and from all parts of the world were so willing to participate, and it showed that there's a real appetite to rethink and to cooperate. And I'd love to capture that and make sure that we make it happen in the follow-up to the report. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Well, thank you so much, all of you. Maybe this discussion didn't really actually cheer us up, but I think it really enlightened us, and there are lots of intriguing questions and challenges to bring with us in this future work. Before we end, I'd just like to say that our next seminar is held next Friday in this place, Medelhavsmuseet, 3rd December, but in the morning, between 10 and 11:30, and the title of the seminar is On Norms and Values for Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights and Gender Equality. So please join us for that seminar. You can sign up on the EBA webpage. And we also hope that you are listening to our podcast. It's a great thing to do when you are jogging, walking, ironing, whatever, then you can be even further enlightened. So thank you, all of you, for joining us, also you who are online. And especially thanks to Therese, to Staffan, and to Thomas. And you may now celebrate Thanksgiving again. So thanks. So thank you.